This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA, September 2007. The New Sun by J S Fletcher. From the time he had taken up the study of astronomy as a pleasant means of spending his newly acquired leisure, and had built himself a small, well-equipped observatory as an adjunct to his house, which stood on one of the highest slopes of Leith Hill, Mequillen had formed the habit of rising from his bed every 2 or 3 hours of a cloudy night to see if the sky had cleared. To some men such a habit would have been highly inconvenient, for many obvious reasons. But Mequillen was in a lucky position. He was unmarried. He possessed much more than ample means. He had therefore no business or profession to attend to, and accordingly no train to catch in the morning to keep office hours. He could sleep at any time of the day he chose, and if he jumped out of bed at 2 o'clock in the morning to find the sky was still cloudy, he could jump back and go to sleep again on the instant. And he was, moreover, an enthusiast of the first order. On a certain night in February of 1920, Mequillen, who had gone to bed at 10 o'clock, suddenly awoke, switched on the electric light at the side of his bed, and, seeing that it was 10 minutes past 12, sprang out, shuffled himself into a thickly padded dressing gown, and hurried up the winding stairs which led to the observatory. One glance into the night showed him a perfectly clear sky. From the vast dome of heaven, wondrously blue, the stars shone out like points of fire. And Mequillen, with a sigh of satisfaction, began his work at the telescope, comparing the sky, field by field, with his star chart, on the chance of finding new variable stars. After his usual fashion, he was immediately absorbed, and the sky remaining clear, he went on working, unconscious of the time, until a deep-toned clock in the room beneath struck the hour of 3. Then Mequillen started, and realized that he had been so absorbed that he had not noticed the striking of 1 or 2, and leaned back from the telescope in a suddenly assumed attitude of relaxation, stretching his arms and casting his eyes to the still clear vault above him. The next instant he became rigid. The next he began to tremble with excitement. The next he could have shouted for joy. For there, in the constellation which astronomers have named Andromeda, Mequillen detected a new star. He knew as he gazed and gazed, intoxicated with the delight and wonder of his discovery, that the burning and glittering object at which he was looking had never shown its light to man before. There was no need to turn to his star charts. Mequillen, being a rich man, was always equipped with the latest information from the greatest observatories in the world. That star, burning with such magnificence, was on no chart. Nay, he himself had taken a photograph of that particular field in the heavens only 24 hours previously, wherein were stars to the 12th magnitude, but the star at which he gazed was not amongst them. It had suddenly blazed up, and as he watched he saw it visibly, plainly, increase in brightness and magnitude. "A new star," he murmured mechanically. "A new star. I wonder who else has seen it." Mequillen continued to watch until, as the February dawn drew near, the clouds spread great curtains between him and the heavens, and the sky and the stars were blotted out. Then he went to his bed, and, in spite of his excitement, he slept soundly until 10 o'clock in the morning. When Mequillen woke and looked out across the Surrey hills and vales, the entire landscape was being rapidly blotted out by a curious mist or fog which seemed to come from nowhere. A vast, mighty blanket of yellow seemed to drop between him and everything as he looked. At one moment he saw the summit of a hill many miles away; the next he could not even see his own garden beneath his windows. And when he went downstairs, half an hour later, the fog had become of the color of gray ash, and the house was full of it, and the electric light was turned on everywhere and to little effect. Mequillen's sister Adela, who kept house for him, with the assistance of a housekeeper and several female servants, came to him in his study, looking scared. "Dan," she said, "isn't there something queer about this fog? It's getting worse." McQuillan laid down a bundle of letters which he had just taken up, and walked out to the front door and into the garden. He looked around him, and he sniffed. "It certainly does seem queer, Addie," he said. "We've certainly never seen a fog like this in these parts since we knew them." The girl sniffed too. "Dan," she said, "it's like as if it were the very finest dust. And look there!" She had been wiping her hand with a tiny wisp of a handkerchief as she spoke, and now she held the handkerchief out to McQuillan. "Look," she repeated. McQuillan looked down, and saw a curious stain, a species of smudge or smear of a faint grey colour. Without making any remark, he ran the tip of his finger over the nearest object, an espalier. The same smudge or smear appeared on his finger. "It's on everything," whispered the girl. "See, it's on my cheek. It's some sort of dust, Dan. What's the matter?" But McQuillan made no answer. He asked for breakfast, and they went in together. By that time the interior of the house was as full of the fog as the exterior was hidden by it, and everything that they touched, plate, china, linen, gave off the grey smear. And by noon everything was wrapped in an ashen grey atmosphere, and the electrical lights had no power beyond a very limited compass. "This is vexatious," said McQuillan. "I was going to have the motor out and take you across to Greenwich. I wanted to make an inquiry at the observatory. Do you know, Addie, I found a new star last night." "A new star!" she said wonderingly. "But you won't go, Dan?" "Won't go?" he said, laughing. "I should like to see anybody go anywhere in this, though it may be only local. By George, weren't the Cockerlynes coming out to dine and sleep tonight?" Addie nodded. "Well, I hope they won't run into this," continued McQuillan. "I'll ring Dick Cockerlyne up and ask him what the weather's like in town, and then I'll ring up the observatory." He went off to the small room in which the telephone was placed. His sister followed him, and as they passed beneath the cluster of lights in the hall, McQuillan saw the girl's face was drawn and pallid. He stopped sharply. "Why, Addie," he said, "frightened?" She laid her hand on his arm, and he felt it trembling. "Dan," she whispered, "I'm horribly frightened. What is this? You know, there's never been anything like this before in our time. What's happened?" McQuillan laughed and patted the hand that lay on his arm. "Come, Addie," he said soothingly. "This isn't like you. I think this fog is uncommon, and I can't account for it. But I've no doubt it can be accounted for. Now, let me ring up Cockerlyne. I've a notion we shall hear they've got a bright morning there in London." The girl shook her head, made as if she would follow him to the telephone, and then suddenly turned away. In the silence a woman's scream rang out. "That's cook in hysterics," said Addie. "I shall have to be brave for the sake of the servants, Dan. They're all as frightened as I am." Nearly an hour later McQuillan came out of the little room, and he called his sister into the study. He closed the door and beckoned her into the arc of the electric light. "This is queer," he said in a whisper. "I've been talking to Cockerlyne and to the observatory. Dick says this fog struck London at 10 o'clock. It's just as it is here, and everything's at a standstill. Dick hasn't the remotest notion how he's going to get away from the city. But that's nothing. Addie, it's all over Europe." The girl made a little inarticulate sound of horror in her throat, and her face whitened. "All over Europe, so they say at Greenwich," continued McQuillan. "From Lisbon to Moscow, and from Inverness to Constantinople. Land and sea, it's everywhere. It's something unexplainable. Such a thing has never been known before. But it's no use getting frightened, Addie. You must be brave. It's no doubt some natural phenomenon that will be accounted for. And phew, how very hot this room is." The girl went close to her brother and laid her hand on his arm. "Dan," she said, "it isn't the room. See, the fire's very low, and the ventilating fan's working. It's the same everywhere. Come into the garden." McQuillan followed her out of the house, knitting his brows and snapping his fingers after his wont when he was puzzled. For several days the weather had been unusually cold for the time of year. Released now from the preoccupation of the last few hours, he suddenly realized that the day was as hot as a July day should be under normal conditions. He turned to the outdoor thermometer. "Why, why," he exclaimed, "it's over 70 now! 70 in February? Addie, something's happened to this old world of ours, that's certain. Look there!" As they watched, the mercury rose, 1, 2, 3 figures. The brother and sister stared at each other, and McQuillan suddenly dropped his hand with a gesture of helplessness. "Well," he said, "there's nothing to be done but to wait. I don't understand it." They went back into the house together, and into McQuillan's study, only to stand and stare at each other in silence. Then Addie made a sudden effort at conversation. "Tell me about the new star, Dan," she said. McQuillan started. "The new star!" he exclaimed. "The new star! My God, I wonder if that has anything to do with this? If The parlor maid, white and scared, came noiselessly into the circle of light within which the brother and sister were standing. "You are wanted on the telephone, sir," she said. McQuillan went off. In a few minutes he came back, shaking his head. "That was the observatory," he said quietly. "This fog, or whatever it is all over the world. Over South Africa, North and South America, India, Australia, anyway. And the heat's increasing." "And the reason?" whispered Addie. McQuillan sat down and dropped his head in his hands. "There's no man can tell the reason," he answered. "He can't even make a guess at it. Something's happened, that's all. We have to wait." And he took up the letters which remained unopened on his desk, and began to sort them out and to read them. "Let's go on with our ordinary routine," he said. "That will be best." The girl left the room, jangling a bunch of keys, but within half an hour she was back, accompanied by the housekeeper. "Dan," she said quietly, "the servants want to go. They think the end of the world's come, and they want to get to their homes." "How do they propose to reach them?" asked McQuillan. "They can't see a yard before them." "I told them that, Mr. McQuillan," said the housekeeper, "but it was of no use. You see, sir, they all live pretty close to here, and they say they can find their way blindfolded. They'd better go, sir, or we shall have more hysterics." "Give me some money for them, Dan," said Addie. McQuillan rose, and unlocking a drawer, handed a cash box to his sister. "I don't see what good money will do them if the world's coming to an end," he said with a laugh. "Well, let them do what they like." When the two women had left him, McQuillan went outside again, and looked at the thermometer hanging on the wall. "My God," he said, "80 already! What can it mean?" And then, standing there in the strange all-wrapping fog in his quiet garden on the slope of the peaceful Surrey hills, McQuillan's thoughts turned to the great city lying only a few miles away. What was happening in London? He saw, with a small exercise of imagination, the congested traffic, the discomfort, the inconvenience, the upsetting of all arrangement and order in an ordinary fog. What, then, must be the effect of this extraordinary one? For McQuillan was sufficiently versed in science to know that the world had never at any rate since historical records of it had begun, known such a day as this. And supposing it lasted, supposing... And then he interrupted his train of thought to glance once more at the thermometer. Yes, he muttered to himself. Yes, but supposing the heat goes on increasing as it's increased during the last few hours. My God, it's awful to contemplate. The house was very quiet when the frightened servants had left it. McQuillan and his sister made some attempt to eat the lunch which the housekeeper had prepared, but the attempt was a farce, and presently they found themselves pacing up and down from room to room, from house to garden, waiting for they knew not what. There was no change in the atmosphere, so far as the fog was concerned, but the thermometer rose steadily, until at 6 o'clock at night it was 90, and they were feeling as if they must soon gasp for breath. And, unknown to Addie, McQuillan went to the telephone and eventually got into communications with Dick Cockerlyne, who was still at his city office. "Dick," he said as steadily as he could, "are you still there?" "I am," came back the answer, in tones that Mequillen could scarcely recognize. "And how is it with you there?" One word came along. Mequillen felt it to be the only word that could come. "Hell." Mequillen shivered, and again spoke. "Dick, what is happening? What " And then he was sharply rung off. From that moment he had no further communication with the outer world. Once, twice, thrice he tried the telephone again before midnight. No response was given. All around the house a silence reigned which was like the silence of a deserted ocean. Nothing but the fog was there; not a voice, even of fear or terror, came up from the valley. And the heat went on steadily increasing. There was no sleep for Mequillen or his sister or the housekeeper that night. They had all changed into the lightest summer garments they could find. By the middle of the night the two women were lying prostrate with exhaustion, and the thermometer was a long way over 100 degrees. Mequillen did all that knowledge could suggest to him to obtain relief and coolness for them, but there was no air. The atmosphere was still, lifeless, leaden. And when the morning came the all enveloping fog was still there, and the heat was still increasing. How they got through that second day Mequillen never knew. He had visions of what might be going on in places where the water supply was bad. He, fortunately, was in command of a splendid and probably inexhaustible supply. He had, too, a well stocked larder, and a well provided cellar of good wine. Only just able to crawl about, he looked to the two women. The housekeeper, a woman of full habit, was more than once on the verge of collapse. Addie's wiriness and excellent physique kept her going. But as it grew to the second midnight, they were all gasping for breath, and Mequillen, making brave efforts to keep the women alive, knew that before many hours were over all would be over for them too. And then, as he lay stretched out in a lounging chair, anxiously watching his sister who lay on a sofa close by, the door pushed open, and Dick Cockerlyne, reeling like a drunken man, staggered in and dropped headlong at Mequillen's side. II. The Refuge. Mequillen summoned up what strength remained in him, and set himself with clenched teeth and fierce resolution to bring Cockerlyne round. Cockerlyne was a big man, a fellow of brawn and muscle, that in ordinary times would have thought nothing of walking 50 miles on end if need arose. Now, looking at his great limbs, scarcely hidden by the thin silk shirt and flannel trousers which clothed them, Mequillen saw that he was wasted as if he had undergone starvation. His face had aged 10 years, and there was a look of horror in its lines and in his half open eyes which told of human fear and terror, and once more Mequillen wondered what was going on in London. He poured liquid, a weak mixture of brandy and seltzer, down the fallen man's throat. Mequillen glanced at his sister. She had paid no attention whatever to Cockerlyne's entrance. She lay motionless, her hands clasped across her bosom, slowly and regularly gasping for breath. But Mequillen knew what would rouse her, for she and Cockerlyne had been engaged for the past 6 months, and were about to be married, and one great source of her anxiety during the past 2 days had been in her fears for his safety. And as he saw Cockerlyne returning to consciousness, he turned to her. "Addie," he whispered, "here is Dick." The girl slowly opened her eyes and turned her head, and a faint flush came to her white cheeks. Mequillen reached across and handed her a glass, out of which he had been giving her liquid food at intervals during the past hour. "Drink that, and then get up and help me with him," he said. Cockerlyne opened his eyes to the full at last, and saw the brother and sister, and he struggled up from the floor. "I got through anyway," he said. "I thought if we are all going to die, I'd see Addie first. Have I been fainting, Dan?" "Lie down again, Addie, this instant," commanded Mequillen sharply. "Now then, Dick, drink the rest of that brandy and seltzer, and then you shall have some of this concentrated meat extract. No nonsense, now. What we all have to do is keep up strength till this passes. I'm off to our housekeeper. I forbid you two to move or to speak until I come back." When he returned, Mequillen found his sister staring at Cockerlyne, and Cockerlyne staring at her, as if they were looking their last at each other. "Come, come," he said, with the best imitation of a laugh that he could raise, "we are not at that stage yet. Now then, obey your doctor." And he fed them both as if they were children, and presently had the gratification of seeing the colour come back to Cockerlyne's face, and a new light into his eyes. The big man suddenly rose, and shook his limbs, and smiled grimly. There were sandwiches on the table, and he reached over and took one in each hand, and began to eat voraciously. "Chuck the nursing, Dan," he growled. "I'm all right. I said I'd get it done, and I've done it. I'm here." Mequillen saw with thankfulness that Cockerlyne was going to be something to stand by. He nodded with assumed coolness. "All right, old chap," he said. "And how did you get here?" Cockerlyne moistened his tongue. "Fought through it," he said grimly. "I've been 30 hours at it." "30 hours!" "Yes," said Mequillen. "You know," continued Cockerlyne, "you know when you telephoned me at 6 last night? After that I think I went mad for a while. Then I got out of the office, and somehow got to the Bank station of the South London. The tube trains ran now and then. I don't know how I did it, but I travelled that way as far as the trains ran, Clapham or somewhere, and then, well, I just made along this way. Of course I knew every bit of the road. It was like sleep walking." Mequillen nodded, and picking up a fan, resumed his occupation of trying to agitate the air about his sister's face. "Well, you're here, Dick," he said. "But London?" Cockerell shivered. "London is oh, I don't know what London is," he answered. "I think half the people are dead, and the other half are mad. Once or twice I went out into the streets. One man you met was on his knees, praying aloud. The next was oh, I don't know. It seemed that hell was let loose, and yet the churches were crammed to the doors. And people were fighting for the liquor in the dram shops and the public houses. I don't seem to remember much. Perhaps I am mad myself now. How long will it be, Dan?" "How long will it be?" asked Mequillen. "The end. I expect this is the end, isn't it?" said Cockerlyne. "What else can it be?" "Don't talk rot," Mequillen said sharply. "I thought you'd come round again. Here, pour some of the stuff out of that bottle into that glass, and carry it to the housekeeper in the next room. Pull yourself together, man." "Sorry," said Cockerlyne, and rose to carry out Mequillen's commands. I'm light-headed, perhaps. Don't ask me any more about what I saw. It sends me off." He went away to the housekeeper, and Mequillen heard him speaking to her in the dry, croaking tones in which they all spoke. And presently Cockerlyne came hurriedly back, and standing at the open door, beckoned him with a shaking hand. Mequillen rose and shambled across to him, looking an interrogation. "Come out in the garden," whispered Cockerlyne, and led the way to the front door. "Listen," he said. "I caught the sound in there. Listen." Mequillen grasped one of the pillars on the porch, and strained his ears. And somewhere, so far off that it might have been 1,000 miles away, he heard what he knew to be the coming of a mighty wind, and instinctively he tightened his grip on the pillar. "It's a cyclone coming, Cockerlyne," he shouted, though all around them was still and quiet. "It'll sweep away all before it, house, everything. Quick, the 2 women!" But before either man could turn to open the door, the great fog was swept away before their eyes, as if it had been literally snatched from them by some gigantic hand from heaven. And where it had been was a burning and a dazzling light of such power that in an instant they were grovelling on the ground before it, with their eyes pressed instinctively in the crooks of their quivering elbows. Part 3. Out of the Illimitable. Of the 2 men, Mequillen was the first to comprehend what had happened, and out of his comprehension came coolness and resource. Never had he thought so quickly in his life. "Dick," he whispered, "keep your eyes shut tightly, and turn and creep back into the hall. I'm doing the same thing. You know the little room on the left? Don't open your eyes until you get there. Now then," he continued with a gasp, as the 2 men reached the room and stood upright, "you can open them here, for the shutters are up. Ah, and yet, you see, although this room should be quite dark, it's almost as light as a normal winter morning." Cockerlyne stared stupidly about him. "For God's sake, Dan, what's happened?" he exclaimed. McQuillan was fumbling in a drawer. He brought out two silk mufflers and passed one to his friend. "I have a very good idea as to what's happened," he answered gravely, "and I'll tell you in a few minutes. But first muffle your eyes. There, you'll see through two thicknesses of the silk. Now for the women. Fortunately, the curtains are closely drawn in both rooms, or I should have feared for their eyesight in that sudden rush of light. Light, Dick, such as the globe has never seen before. Dick, we've got to blindfold them and then get them into the darkest place in the house. There's an underground room, not a cellar, which I've sometimes used for experiments. We must get them downstairs." It was easy to see, in spite of the mufflers, that the light in the hall was blinding, and in the curtained study as bright as on an open sea on a cloudless day in summer. And Addie was lying on the sofa with her arms crossed over her forehead and eyes, obviously surprised and distressed by the sudden glare. "Don't move your arms!" exclaimed McClellan sharply. "Keep your eyes shut as tight as you can." "What is it?" she asked. "Has the fog gone and the sun come?" "The fog has gone and a sun has come," replied McClellan, "and its light is unbearable just yet. Now, Addie, I'm going to blindfold you and take you and Mrs. Jepson down to the underground room. We will all have to get used to the light by degrees. Do just what I tell you, and Dick and I will make you comfortable." But when the two women were safely disposed into a room into which scarcely any light ever penetrated in an ordinary way, but which was then as light as noontide, McQuillan drew Cockerlyne into the study, and groping his way to the windows, closed the shutters and drew the curtains over them. "Now you can take off your muffler," he said quietly. "There, you see, it's light enough even now to read print and to see the time. And you perceive the time? 12:30, midnight." Cockerlyne's face blanched. He swallowed something and straightened himself. "What is this, McQuillan?" he asked quietly. "Do you know?" McQuillan shook his head. "Not with certainty," he answered, "but I think I know. 48 hours ago I discovered a new star, which increased in magnitude at a surprising rate even while I watched it. Now I think that it is a new sun." "A new sun!" exclaimed Cockerlyne. "Impossible!" "Call it what you will," said McQuillan. "It is, I am certain, at any rate, a vast heavenly body of fire, which was travelling towards this part of space at an inconceivable rate when I first saw it, and is, probably at this moment, nearer to us than our own sun is. Do you feel the heat is increasing?" "Yes," replied Cockerlyne, "but it is different in character." "It is different in character because the wrapping of infinitely fine dust which has been round us has been drawn away," said McQuillan. "But it will increase in intensity." Cockerlyne gripped the table. "And," he whispered, "in an hour or two we shall be shriveled up, consumed, like shreds of wool thrown into a furnace," answered McQuillan. Cockerlyne straightened himself. "All right, Dan," he said quietly. "I'm glad I came here. What's to be done now?" McQuillan had turned to a nest of drawers in one of the recesses of his study. He brought out some spectacles fitted with lenses of very dark glass, and handed one to Cockerlyne. "We will make an attempt to see this new sun," he said. "Put these spectacles on, and for the present fold that muffler about your eyes again once. You'll see through the muffler and the spectacles. And now come up to the observatory." In the observatory Cockerlyne understood little or nothing of the preparations which McClellan made. Conscious only of the terrible heat, he stood waiting and thinking of the terrible fate which was about to befall them, and suddenly a terrible impatience seized him. If there was but an hour or so to live, his place was with the woman he loved. "Look here, Dan," he exclaimed, "I'm going down. If the end's coming, then—" But McClellan laid a hand on his arm and drew him forward, at the same time removing the muffler from his head. "We will go down soon, Cockerlyne," he said. "We must, for we shall have to tell them. But first, look! You can look with safety now." And then Cockerlyne, following his friend's instructions, looked, and saw wide spread above him the dome of the heavens. But never before had he so seen it in all his life. From north to south, from east to west, it glowed with the effulgence of shining brass, and in the northeast hung a great globe of fiery red, vaster in dimension than the sun which the world had known till then, and, even when seen through the protections which Mequillen had prepared, coruscating and glittering with darting and leaping flames. "My God!" said Cockerlyne in a hushed voice. "My God! Dan, is that it?" "That is it," answered Mequillen quietly. "It is now nearly twice the magnitude of our sun, and it is coming nearer. This is no time to make calculations or even speculations, but I believe it is, at any rate, as near to us as our sun is. Come away, Cockerlyne. I want to look out on the world. Hold my hand and follow me." And he dragged Cockerlyne away through a trap door into a dark passage, and then into a darker room. "Keep your hands over your spectacles for a while, and get accustomed to the light by degrees," he said. "I am going to open an observation shutter here, through which we can see a vast stretch of country to the north. It will be a surprise to me if much of it is not already in flames. Now, if you are ready." Cockerlyne covered his eyes as he heard the click of the observation shutter. Even then, and through the thick black glasses which he was wearing, he felt the extraordinary glare of the light which entered. Presently Mequillen touched his arm. "You can look now," he said. "See, it's just as I thought. The land's on fire." Cockerlyne looked out upon the great sweep of hill and valley, wood and common, which stretches across the fairest part of Surrey, from the heights above Shere and Albury to those beyond Reigate. He saw little villages, with their spires and towers and red roofs and tall grey gables. He saw the isolated farms, the stretches of wood, the hillside coppices, the patches of heath and the expanse of green which indicated land untouched by spade or plough. It was a scene with which he had been familiar from boyhood. Of late he had explored every nook and corner of it with Addie Mequillen, and at all times of the year it had seemed beautiful to him. But under the glare and brilliance of this extraordinary light everything seemed changed, and over that vast prospect great pillars of smoke and flame were rising to the sky. From the valley beneath them came the shrieks and cries of men and women, and as the two men watched they saw the evergreens in Mequillen's garden suddenly turn to the whiteness of paper, and shrivel and disappear in fine ashes. "Look there," whispered Mequillen, pointing a shaking finger. "There, Dorking's on fire, and yonder, Reigate too." Cockerlyne tried to speak, but his tongue rattled in his mouth like a dry pea in a drier pod. He touched Mequillen's arm and pointed downward, and Mequillen nodded. "Yes," he said, "we had better go down to them. They've got to know." He took Cockerlyne by the hand and led him back to the observatory, which, in spite of the fact that all the shutters were drawn, was full of light. As they stepped into it, a spark of white flame suddenly appeared in the woodwork, and ran like lightning around the rim of the dome. "On fire," Mequillen said quietly. "It's no good, Cockerlyne. We can't do anything. The end's come. Oh, my God, what's this? What is this? Cockerlyne! Cockerlyne, where are you?" For just as suddenly as they had seen the greyness of the great fog snatched away from the earth, so now they saw the extraordinary light which had succeeded it snatched away. It was gone in the flash of an eye, with the speed of lightning, and as it went they felt the earth move and shudder, and all around them fell a blackness such as they had never known. And as the two men gripped each other in their terror, there suddenly burst upon the dome of the observatory a storm of what seemed like bullets, fierce, insistent, incessant. The serpent-like tail of the fire in the woodwork quivered once and died out, and Mequillen, trembling in every limb, released his hold on Cockerlyne and staggered against the nearest wall. "Rain!" he said. "Rain!" In the darkness Mequillen heard Cockerlyne first stumble about, and then fall heavily. Then he knew that Cockerlyne had fainted, and he made his way to a switch and turned on the electric light, and got water to bring him round. But when he came round, Cockerlyne for some minutes croaked and gabbled incessantly, and it was not until McQuillan had hurried down to the dining room for brandy for him that he regained his senses and was able to sit up, gasping and staring about him. He pointed a shaking finger to the aperture in the dome, through which the rain was pouring, unheeded by McQuillan, in a ceaseless cascade. "Where is it?" he gasped. What's come of it?" McQuillan shook him to his feet and made him swallow more brandy. "Pull yourself together, Cockerlyne," he said. "This is no time to talk science. This is a time to act. Come down, man. We must see to the women. We've just escaped fire. Now we're likely to meet our deaths by water. Listen to that rain. Here, help me close that shutter. Now, downstairs. It's lucky we're on a hillside, Cockerlyne, but the people in the valleys. Come on!" And leaving Cockerlyne to follow him, McQuillan ran down through the house, to find his sister and the housekeeper in the hall. As he saw them, he knew that they had realized what he now had time to realize, that the terrible heat was dying away, and that it was becoming easier and easier to breathe. As he passed it, he glanced at the hanging thermometer, and saw the mercury falling in a steady, swift descent. McQuillan caught his sister in his arms and pressed her to him. She looked anxiously into his face. "Dick," she said. "He's safe. He's coming," said McQuillan. Addie suddenly collapsed and hid her face in her hands. The housekeeper was already in a heap in the nearest chair, sobbing and moaning. As Cockerlyne came slowly down the stairs, McQuillan saw that, strong man as he was, his nerves had been shaken so much that he was trembling like a leaf. Once more McQuillan had to summon all his energies together in the task of bringing his companions round, and as he moved about from one to the other, his quick ear heard the never ceasing rattle of rain, which was heavier than any tropical rain that ever fell. And presently he caught the sound of newly forming cascades and waterfalls, cutting new ways from the hilltops to the level lands of the valleys. Now the normal coolness of middle winter was coming back. The women picked up the wraps they had thrown aside. The men hurried into greatcoats. And as February dawn came gray and slow across the hills, McQuillan and Cockerlyne went up to the observatory and into the little lookout turret, from which they had seen the spires of smoke and flame rising from the land only a few hours before. The rain was still falling, but with no more violence than that of a tropical rainstorm. But the air was throbbing, pulsating, humming with the noise of falling waters. 100 yards away from the house, a churning and seething mass of yellow foam was tearing a path wide and deep through a copse of young pine. Down in the valley, immediately beneath them, lay a newly formed lake. In the valleys on every side, as far as the eye could reach, lay patches of silvery hue which they knew to be great sheets of water. And now the air was cool, and the hitherto tortured lungs could breathe in comfort. "McQuillan," said Cockerlyne after a long silence, "what happened?" But McQuillan shook his head. "I am as a child standing at the edge of a great ocean," he answered. "I cannot say definitely. I think that the great star which we saw rushing upon us was suddenly arrested, split into fragments when that darkness fell, and that we were saved. Once more, Cockerlyne, the old world, a speck of space, will move on. For look there!" And Cockerlyne turned as McQuillan pointed, and saw, slowly rising over the Surrey hills, the kindly sun of a gray February morning. End of The New Sun, by J S Fletcher.